My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I was the one driving. Sophia sat next to me in the passenger seat, head tipped against the window, her skin gone this weird gray-white color I'd never seen on her before. 10 minutes earlier she'd been laughing at something on her phone, one of those stupid videos she always sent me at midnight. Now she couldn't hold her own head up straight. I ran a red light on Fifth. Didn't even register it until I was already through the intersection. I just needed to get her through those doors before whatever this was got worse. Almost there. I kept saying, mostly to myself, "I'm fine," she mumbled, except the words came out slurred at the edges. And that scared me more than anything else that morning. The ER doors slid open with that hiss they always have, and the cold air inside hit us both at once. A nurse spotted her stumbling against me before I even got a word out, and within seconds they had a wheelchair under her. They wheeled her back fast, firing off questions I could barely follow. Allergies, medications, when did this start? And Sophia's eyes found mine for 1 second before the double doors swallowed her. Then I was just standing there, alone, in a waiting room that smelled like hand sanitizer, holding my car keys so tight the metal dug into my palm. A woman behind the front counter slid a clipboard toward me. "Anything you can tell us about her medical history helps," she said. Not unkindly, just tired. Like she'd said it 100 times that shift already. I picked up the pen. My hand was still shaking a little. That's when I noticed something sitting on the counter next to the clipboard. The intake form Sophia had filled out herself minutes earlier, before her hand got too unsteady to keep writing. It hadn't been filed yet, just sitting there. I wasn't trying to read it. I want to be honest about that part. My eyes just landed on one line the way your eyes catch a word on a page without meaning to. Relationship to patient. Under that, in her handwriting, a little shaky, but still hers, still recognizable. She hadn't written neighbor. "Sir? You okay?" I looked up. The receptionist was watching me with this concerned little frown. "Yeah," I said. "Sorry. Yeah, I'm fine." I was not fine. My chest felt like someone had wrapped a rope around it and pulled it tight in one motion. For years. 4 years living across the hall from this woman. For years of borrowed sugar, late-night talks through a cracked door, her spare key hanging on a hook by my kitchen sink. And I had never once let myself say out loud what 5 words on a hospital form were now saying for her, without her even meaning for me to see them. I sat down in one of those stiff plastic chairs because my legs didn't feel like they'd hold me up much longer. Around me, other people waited too. A guy with his arm in a makeshift sling, an older woman flipping through a magazine that was probably 3 years out of date, a kid asleep across 2 chairs while his mom stared at nothing. None of them knew that my entire week, my entire life, honestly, had just tilted sideways over one line of handwriting. I told myself I'd misread it. Maybe the lighting in there was bad. Maybe I'd seen what some part of me wanted to see instead of what was actually written. But some other part of me, the part that had spent 4 years pretending everything between us was simple, easy, uncomplicated, already knew better. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. Not sitting in a plastic chair with my stomach in knots and no idea if she was even okay. I checked my phone. 9:47 a.m. We'd left the apartment at 9:20. 27 minutes since she collapsed in her kitchen. It felt like it had happened in another lifetime. To understand why 5 words on a piece of paper could knock the wind out of me like that, you'd probably need the whole story first. You'd need to go back to how a nurse and a guy doing freelance contract work ended up sharing a hallway, a set of spare keys, and, apparently according to that form, a whole lot more than either of us had ever said out loud. Because 4 years ago, Sophia was just the new tenant across the hall. Someone I nodded at in the elevator when it actually worked. She wasn't supposed to become the reason my chest tightened every time my phone buzzed with her name on the screen. She wasn't supposed to become the person whose laugh I listened for through the shared wall at 11 at night, the person whose bad days somehow turned into my bad days too, without me ever agreeing to that arrangement out loud. But somewhere between those first polite nods in the hallway and this exact moment, sitting under fluorescent lights, staring at a set of double doors that wouldn't open, something had grown between us. Something neither of us had ever had the nerve to name. A nurse walked past carrying a chart, and for 1 second my whole body went rigid, thinking she was coming for me with news. She wasn't. She walked right past into another room, and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I looked back down at my hands. They still hadn't stopped shaking. Whatever those doors held on the other side, whatever the next hour was going to tell me, I already knew one thing for certain. If Sophia walked out of there okay, I wasn't going to sit on this feeling for one more day. For years of silence felt like plenty. More than plenty. Felt, sitting there, like it had already cost me almost everything. I just didn't know yet how close I'd actually come to losing the chance to fix it. I thought back to that morning, trying to pin down the exact second things went wrong. Like if I could find it, I could somehow undo it. She'd been standing at the counter pouring coffee, still in the t-shirt she slept in, hair pulled back in a knot that was already falling apart. She'd said something about her shift schedule changing next month, something about maybe finally getting a weekend off. I hadn't even really been listening, not fully. I'd been half checking my phone for a client email I was waiting on. That thought alone made my stomach turn. I'd been distracted during what might have been one of the last normal conversations we ever had, and I hadn't even noticed it happening. A vending machine against the far wall hummed and clicked, and I got up just to have something to do with my hands, feeding it quarters for a bottle of water I didn't actually want. My reflection caught in the machine's plastic front for a second. Hair a mess, jacket still half-zipped from throwing it on that morning. Eyes that looked like they belonged to someone who hadn't slept in days instead of hours. I barely recognized myself. Back in the chair, I turned my phone over in my hands a few times before finally unlocking it. There was a group chat with two guys I did contract work with, something about a job starting Monday, completely irrelevant now. I typed out a message saying I might be late, then deleted it, then typed it again because Monday still existed whether I was ready for it or not. The older woman across from me finally got called back around then, and a young couple took her place, the guy holding an ice pack to his own hand, wincing every time he shifted in his seat. Life just kept moving around me in its ordinary, indifferent way, other people's small emergencies overlapping with mine in a waiting room that didn't care whose crisis was bigger. I thought about calling someone. My sister, maybe, or one of the guys from the group chat. But there wasn't really anyone to call who would understand what I was actually sitting with. Because the truth was I wasn't just scared Sophia was sick. I was scared I'd spent 4 years being too careful to ever find out if she felt what I apparently already knew she felt, and now some machine somewhere down that hallway was going to decide whether I'd ever get the chance to do anything about it. I set the water bottle down without opening it. My hands had finally stopped shaking, but something else had taken its place. A kind of stillness that felt worse, honestly, like my body had run out of ways to react and had just gone quiet instead. Somewhere behind those doors, machines were beeping, feet were moving fast down hallways. Decisions were being made about a woman I hadn't told the truth in 4 years. And all I could do out here was wait, and think, and wonder if I'd get a chance to fix that. The waiting room clock said 10:15 when I finally made myself sit back and breathe. Nobody had come out yet. No update, no nurse, nothing. Just me. A stack of old magazines nobody was reading, and my own head running through every worst-case scenario it could invent. To keep myself from spiraling completely, I did the thing I always do when things get too loud in my head. I went back to the beginning. Back to before any of this. Before the form, before the fire escape talks, before any of it. For years earlier, I didn't even know her name yet. I'd moved into that building during one of the rougher stretches of my life. I just walked away from a job that had worn me down to almost nothing. Long story, not a great one. And I was piecing together a living doing contract work, freelance gigs, whatever paid that month. Money was tight most weeks. Sleep was rarer than money. Most nights back then I came home too wiped out to do anything but collapse on the couch and stare at the ceiling until I fell asleep with my shoes still on. Sophia moved in across the hall about 2 weeks after I did. I remember hearing boxes scraping the floor through the shared wall, and a woman humming some song I didn't recognize while she unpacked. First time I actually saw her was in the hallway a few days later, both of us wrestling grocery bags and keys at the same time, the elevator broken, again. "It's always broken," she said, not even looking up from her keys. "I've lived here 2 weeks and I've used the stairs more than the elevator. Building's older than both of us combined," I said. "I think the elevator's just tired." She laughed at that. Small laugh, but real. Then she disappeared into her apartment, and that was it. That was the whole conversation. I didn't think about it again for at least a week. I found out later she'd moved to the city for a nursing job at the hospital a few blocks over. The same hospital I'd end up racing her to 4 years later, though obviously neither of us knew that yet. She'd spent the 2 years before the move taking care of her father until he passed. Moving here was supposed to be her fresh start, the same way it was supposed to be mine. We didn't talk about any of that back then, though. We were just two tired strangers who happened to share a hallway. It started small, the way these things usually do. She left a spare key with me for the nights her shifts ran long and she didn't want to be locked out at 2 in the morning, half asleep on her feet. I noticed her kitchen faucet dripping one evening while I was over borrowing sugar for something I was baking. Badly, and I fixed it before she even had the chance to call a plumber. She started leaving a mug of coffee out on the counter some mornings, right by my door if she left before I woke up. No note, no explanation, just there. Neither of us called it anything. We were just neighbors helping each other out the way people are supposed to, or at least the way people are supposed to in theory. But the small things kept stacking. Takeout on nights neither of us felt like cooking. Split evenly, her kitchen table one week, mine the next. Evenings out on the fire escape outside her window, watching the city lights flick on one building at a time, talking about nothing important and somehow, without either of us noticing exactly when it happened, saying everything that actually mattered. She told me about her father on one of those nights. I remember she wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was watching the traffic below, arms wrapped around her knees. He used to say the worst thing about getting sick wasn't the sickness, she said. It was watching everyone around you get scared for you. He hated that part most. I told her about the job I'd walked away from, the one that had left me feeling like a shell of a person by the end. She listened. She didn't try to fix it or offer advice I hadn't asked for. She just listened, and something about that, about someone just letting you talk without trying to solve you, was exactly what I needed and didn't know how to ask for. Months passed, then a year, then 2 more after that. We never called it a relationship. We never called it anything, honestly, which in hindsight is a little ridiculous given how much of each other's lives we'd absorbed by then. There was this unspoken rule between us. Never said out loud, never written down anywhere. That we'd keep things easy. No labels, no pressure. Just 2 people who happened to live across a hallway from each other and happened to care a lot more than most neighbors ever do. I told myself that was enough. I told myself Sophia deserved someone steadier than a guy still piecing his career back together one contract at a time. Someone who had his whole life figured out instead of someone still figuring out rent some months. She never talked seriously about dating anyone in those 4 years, and I never asked why because some part of me was scared of the answer either way. It felt safer to protect what we already had than risk it by saying something that couldn't be taken back. A door opened somewhere down the hall from the waiting room, and I jolted upright, heart slamming. But it was just an orderly pushing an empty bed toward another wing. Not for me. Not yet. I sat back down, rubbing my hands over my face. Looking back now, replaying 4 years of fire escape nights while I waited to find out if she was okay, I understood something I wished I'd understood a long time earlier. Some of the biggest regrets in life don't come from the things that go wrong on their own. They come from the words you were too scared to say while you still had the chance to say them. And that morning, the one that started with her laughing about a coworker over coffee and ended with her collapsing on her own kitchen floor, had almost become the morning I ran out of chances completely. I checked the clock again. 10:31 now. 16 minutes since I'd last looked. Still nothing. There was one night, near the end of that second year, that I hadn't let myself think about in a long time. She'd come home from a bad shift, one of those nights where you could tell just from the way she closed the apartment door that something had gone wrong. Patient hadn't made it. She didn't give me details, and I didn't ask for them. She just knocked on my door around midnight, still in her scrubs, and asked if I had anything stronger than tea. I didn't, actually. I had a bottle of cheap whiskey I'd been given as a thank you gift from a client and never opened. We split it on my couch, mostly in silence, the TV on with the sound low, playing something neither of us was watching. At some point she put her head on my shoulder, and I remember sitting very still, terrified that moving even slightly would break whatever was happening. She fell asleep like that for almost 20 minutes before waking up embarrassed, apologizing, gathering herself to go back to her own apartment. "You don't have to go," I'd said. It was the closest I'd ever come, up to that point, to saying something true. I should, she said. Early shift. And that was it. She left. I sat there a long time after the door clicked shut, replaying the weight of her head on my shoulder, wondering if I'd imagined the moment meaning more than it probably did. I thought about that night now, sitting in the same kind of plastic chair, waiting on the same kind of uncertain outcome, except this time there was no shift to use as an excuse to leave the room. This time I just had to sit with it. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past the row of chairs, nodding at me the way people do when they've worked somewhere long enough to recognize the specific kind of tired that comes from waiting on bad news, or maybe just uncertain news which somehow felt worse. I nodded back, not really seeing him, still somewhere back on that couch 2 years earlier. I thought about all the other almost moments too. The time she'd shown up at my door with a birthday cake, badly decorated, because she'd remembered a date I'd mentioned once in passing almost a year earlier and never brought up again. The time I'd driven 40 minutes out of my way to bring her soup when she had the flu, telling myself it was just what neighbors did, even though I knew, somewhere underneath the excuse, that it wasn't. None of it had ever added up to anything on paper. It had just quietly become the shape of our lives. For years of small proof neither of us had ever spelled out directly. Sitting there now, replaying all of it while machines beeped somewhere behind a set of doors I couldn't get through, I understood exactly how much time Careful had cost us. Careful had gotten us 4 years of almost, 4 years of nearly, and it had taken a hospital form, of all things, to finally drag the truth out into the open where neither of us could keep pretending not to see it. Her laugh was the last normal sound I heard before everything went sideways. We'd been sitting at her kitchen table around 9 that morning, sharing coffee the way we did most Saturdays, and she was telling me about a patient on her floor who swore the break room coffee machine was haunted because it only worked when nobody was watching it. I remember laughing hard enough that I nearly knocked my mug over reaching for a napkin. "I'm serious," she said, grinning. "Ask anyone on 3rd floor. That machine's got a personality. It's a coffee machine, Sophia. A haunted one." Then, mid-sentence into whatever she was about to say next, her smile just dropped. Gone, like someone flipped a switch. She grabbed the edge of the counter like the floor had tilted underneath her. Hey, you okay?" She didn't answer. Her face had gone pale in a way I'd genuinely never seen on her before, and before I could get around the table, her knees just gave out. I caught her before she hit the tile, her body suddenly heavy and limp against my arm in a way that didn't feel real. I didn't think. I just moved. I got her down 2 flights of stairs faster than I would have thought possible, one arm around her shoulders, half carrying, half guiding, because waiting on that elevator, broken again of course, would have cost us minutes we didn't have. She kept mumbling that she was fine, that it was probably nothing, but her words came out slurred at the edges, and that scared me more than anything she was actually saying. Every red light on the way felt like it lasted an hour. I remember gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white, glancing over every few seconds just to check she was still awake, still breathing, still there. That drive normally takes 12 minutes. That morning it felt endless. Which brings me back to where I started. The double doors, the clipboard, the line on that intake form that stopped my whole body cold. Relationship to patient, not neighbor, something else. Something I'd spent 4 years not letting myself imagine she might actually feel too. I sat in that plastic chair replaying it, over and over, wondering if panic had twisted the words into something they weren't. I almost had myself convinced of that, right up until a nurse walked over, chart in hand, and asked me to confirm some contact details. She glanced at her clipboard, then back up at me with this small, gentle look. "You're listed as her main emergency contact," she said, like it was routine. Like it wasn't the thing currently taking the floor out from under me for the 2nd time that morning. "Most important person to call if anything happens. That's still accurate?" "Yeah," I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected. That's accurate." She nodded and walked off, already moving on to whatever came next on her list. Completely unaware she just confirmed the thing I'd been trying to talk myself out of believing. For 4 years I'd told myself I was protecting something by staying quiet. Told myself keeping my feelings boxed up was the responsible choice, the safe one. Sitting there, waiting to find out if the woman across the hall was going to be okay. I realized exactly how much time we'd both wasted pretending we didn't feel what we clearly felt. I thought about every fire escape night, every borrowed cup of sugar, every moment I could have said something honest and chose silence instead because silence felt safer. I thought about how easily all 4 years of it could have ended that morning without either of us ever saying the actual truth out loud. 11:03. The clock on the wall ticked forward another minute, and I watched the second hand move like it owed me something. A man 2 chairs down was on the phone, talking low about someone's surgery running long. An older woman across from me kept glancing at the doors the same way I was, like we were both silently rooting for the same thing without acknowledging each other. I wondered whose person she was waiting on. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No texts. Just a photo Sophia had sent me the night before, badly lit, blurry, of her cat doing something dumb with no caption because she never captioned those. She just sent them and let me figure it out. I stared at that photo for a long time. The doors finally opened at 11:12. Not for me. A woman in scrubs walked out escorting an elderly man in a wheelchair, his daughter trailing behind with a bag of his things. I watched them go, then looked back at the closed doors, and made myself a promise sitting right there in that uncomfortable chair. If Sophia walked out of there okay, if I got one more chance, I wasn't going to waste it being careful with my words anymore. I'd been careful for 4 years. Careful hadn't gotten either of us anywhere except sitting in separate silences, 3 feet and 1 wall apart, pretending that was enough. I texted my sister while I waited, mostly just to have something to do besides stare at the doors. Told her Sophia was in the hospital, that it looked like she was going to be okay. My sister called back almost immediately instead of texting, which she never does. "Is she really okay?" she asked. No hello, straight to the point the way she always is. "They think so. Exhaustion, dehydration. She's been running herself into the ground with double shifts. And you? You sound wrecked." I almost laughed, except nothing about the sound that came out of me actually resembled a laugh. "I saw something on a form," I said. "The relationship one." She didn't put neighbor. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Daniel," my sister said finally, in that tone she uses when she's about to say something I don't want to hear but need to. "You've been telling me for 2 years this woman was just a neighbor. I've met her. Nobody looks at their neighbor the way she looks at you. That's not. We agreed to keep things simple. You agreed to be scared," she said. "There's a difference." Before I could argue, she added quieter, "Is she going to be okay?" "Yeah, I think so." "Then maybe stop being scared, Daniel. You don't get unlimited mornings like this one." I didn't have a response for that, so I told her I had to go, that someone might come out with news any second, and she let me off the phone without pushing further, though I could tell she wanted to. I sat there afterward, turning her words over. You don't get unlimited mornings like this one. She wasn't wrong. I thought about every year that had passed with Sophia and me circling the same unspoken thing, telling ourselves the arrangement worked fine as it was, that naming it might break something that didn't need fixing. Except it did need fixing. It had needed fixing for a long time, and it had taken watching her collapse on her kitchen floor to make that obvious. A woman a few chairs down struck up a quiet conversation with me somewhere around 11:20, the kind strangers have in waiting rooms when the waiting gets unbearable and small talk becomes a survival tactic. She was there for her husband, some kind of chest pain that had turned out to be nothing serious, thankfully, and she was just killing time until his discharge paperwork cleared. She asked who I was there for. "My neighbor," I said, and then, hearing myself say it, added, "Actually, I don't know what to call her anymore. Something more than that." The woman smiled like she understood exactly what I meant, the way people who've sat in enough hospital waiting rooms tend to understand things without needing them explained. I'd mentioned, almost as a joke, that I'd blown through a red light getting here, and she just shook her head. "Whatever she is to you," she said. "She's lucky someone cared enough to run a red light for her." Her husband's paperwork came through not long after that, and she squeezed my arm on her way past, wishing me luck with the kind of easy warmth strangers sometimes have for each other in places like that. Gone from my life 2 minutes after I met her, but somehow exactly what I needed to hear right then. I sat back down, the water bottle from earlier still unopened beside me, and let her words sit with the rest of the morning's weight. It wasn't much, just a stranger's offhand comment. But it landed somewhere I needed it to land. The doctor finally came out at 11:40, and I was on my feet before I even registered standing up. He had the kind of face that gives things away before words do. Not grim, but focused, working through what to say. That focus lasted maybe 3 seconds before it eased into something calmer, and I felt my whole chest loosen a fraction. "She's going to be okay," he said. "Severe dehydration, on top of what looks like weeks of exhaustion catching up with her all at once. We're running a couple more tests just to rule out anything else, but I expect a full recovery with proper rest." My knees actually went a little soft hearing that. I grabbed the back of the nearest chair without really deciding to. "Can I see her?" "Give us 20 minutes. She's asking for you, though, so I don't think you'll have to wait long." 19 minutes later, I counted, because apparently that's what I do under stress now. A nurse walked me back. Sophia was sitting up in the bed, and 4 taped to the back of her hand, color back in her face, looking tired but unmistakably like herself again. The second she saw me, she started to say something that sounded like the beginning of an apology. "Don't," I said, before she could get past the first word. "Don't you dare apologize to me right now. I scared you." "Yeah, you did." I pulled the plastic chair closer to the bed and sat down, closer to her than I probably needed to be. "I'm allowed to be scared. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong." She gave me this small, tired smile, and reached over to squeeze my hand once before letting go. Neither of us said anything about the form. Not yet. I wasn't ready, and honestly, in that moment, it didn't feel like the right time. She'd just been discharged from a hospital bed, hooked up to fluids 20 minutes earlier. That conversation could wait. They released her around 2 that afternoon. We stepped outside into an ordinary-looking day, cars driving by, someone walking a dog 2 doors down, sky an unremarkable blue, and none of it matched how much had shifted inside me over the last 5 hours. I helped her into the passenger seat again, this time slower, more careful, and during the quiet drive home neither of us said much. She dozed against the window for most of it. I kept glancing over every couple minutes anyway, an old habit from that morning I wasn't ready to drop yet. Not everyone gets a warning like that one. Not everyone gets handed a second chance after almost losing someone. I had mine, buckled into the passenger seat, breathing slow and even, asleep against the glass. The days after moved slower than usual, in the way days do when normal routine gets interrupted. Her doctor told her a week off, no shifts, no rushing, actual rest, and she groaned about it but didn't argue, which told me more about how wiped out she actually was than anything she said out loud. So I took over the basics. Grocery runs. Dinner most nights, nothing impressive, usually pasta or something simple I knew how not to burn, though I did burn the garlic bread twice that week, which she never let me forget. I made sure she was drinking enough water, even when she rolled her eyes at me for reminding her for what she called the 11th time today. "Daniel, I heard you the first 10. She apologized for being a burden almost daily that week. Every time I told her the same thing, more or less. It wasn't a burden. Taking care of her felt like the first genuinely honest thing I'd done in longer than I wanted to admit, even if I still hadn't found the nerve to say the actual words out loud yet. Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after the hospital, she was napping on the couch, and I decided to tidy up her living room a little, mostly just to keep my hands busy. That's when I found a small journal wedged half under one of the couch cushions, tucked between the cushion and the armrest like it had slipped there by accident rather than been hidden on purpose. I wasn't looking for it. I want to be clear about that part because it matters. I moved the cushion to fluff it, and the journal slid out and landed open on the floor at my feet. I wasn't planning to read it either, but one line, written across the open page in her handwriting, the same handwriting from the hospital form, unmistakably hers, caught my eye before I could stop myself or look away. I stood there holding it for a long moment, the apartment quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and Sophia's steady breathing from the couch. Whatever I just read, it wasn't something I could unsee or pretend I hadn't. And somewhere in the back of my mind, underneath the surprise, I already understood that whatever I did next with what I now knew was going to decide everything between us. one way or the other. I closed the journal slowly. My hands weren't shaking this time. They were just still. Back in the days right after the hospital, before I found the journal, there'd been smaller moments too, ones I hadn't thought much of at the time but kept replaying now. Monday night, her second day home, she'd asked me to sit with her while she watched some baking competition show, insisting I had opinions about it whether I wanted them or not. I didn't, not really, but I sat anyway, and about halfway through the episode she'd reached over without looking and taken my hand, resting it on the couch cushion between us like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Neither of us said anything about it. I didn't pull away. We just sat like that until the episode ended and she got tired and went to bed. Tuesday, she tried to insist on doing her own laundry, wobbling a little on her feet halfway down the hallway to the building's shared machines before I caught up and took the basket out of her hands. She'd argued about it the whole way down the stairs, calling me overprotective, though there wasn't much bite behind it. I noticed, folding her clothes later that day, a faded t-shirt with a hospital logo from years back, from before I knew her, some old job maybe, or a fun run she'd done once. Small pieces of a life she'd lived before I was in it. It struck me, standing there with a stranger's shirt from her past folded in my hands, how much of her I still didn't know, and how much I wanted the chance to find out the rest. Wednesday morning, before the journal, she'd made a joke over breakfast about how I was turning into her personal nurse. The world's worst nurse, she called me, since I couldn't tell a thermometer from a blood pressure cuff. I told her I was doing my best with limited resources. She laughed, and for a second, watching her laugh at the kitchen table with morning light coming through the window behind her, something in my chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with worry anymore. Now, holding the journal, all those small moments from the past few days lined up differently in my head. Less like ordinary caretaking and more like evidence I'd been too nervous to read correctly the first time around. I set the journal back exactly where I'd found it, careful to match the angle it had been at before, and I stood in the middle of her living room for a long minute just breathing, listening to her steady breathing from the couch, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with what I now knew. Part of me wanted to wake her up right then and say everything. Another part of me, the more cautious part that had run this relationship for 4 years, argued that she was still recovering, still tired, still not fully herself, and that dumping 4 years of unspoken feelings on her midnap wasn't fair to either of us. That part won out for the moment. I went back into the kitchen, started pulling out ingredients for dinner, and let myself sit with the decision a little longer, turning it over the way you turn over a decision you already know you've made but aren't quite ready to admit out loud yet. I checked on her twice while I cooked, just glancing over the counter to make sure she was still breathing easy, still just sleeping and not something worse. Both times she was fine, curled up under the blanket, one hand tucked under her cheek the way she always slept, according to 4 years of catching glimpses of her through a cracked door on lazy weekend mornings. Both times I made myself go back to the stove instead of standing there staring at her like some kind of stalker, though it took real effort. The line I read said that sometimes the greatest love stories hide inside ordinary hallways, where two frightened people spend years pretending friendship is enough. I slid the journal back into the same spot I'd found it, tucked half under the cushion exactly where it had been, and I didn't read another word past that one sentence. I didn't need to. Something about those specific words hit harder than anything I'd read in a long time, because they weren't about someone else's story at all. They were about us, whether she'd meant for anyone to read them that way or not. I sat with that for the rest of the afternoon, half watching some show neither of us was really following while she dozed on and off, replaying 4 years of quiet hallway moments in my head. All the times I'd almost said something and stopped myself right at the edge of it, telling myself later, not yet, not now. By the time she woke up properly around 6, feeling a little stronger than she had that morning, I'd already decided I was done waiting. "You're being weird," she said, watching me move around her kitchen. "Weirder than usual, I mean. I'm making dinner. You always make dinner. You're being weird about it." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and padded over to the doorway, watching me with this curious, slightly suspicious look. "What's going on?" I didn't answer right away. I opened the window over the sink instead, letting the evening air in, the sound of traffic drifting up from the street below mixing with whatever was cooking on the stove. Nothing fancy. I'd run out of ideas by day 4 of playing chef, so it was just pasta again, with whatever vegetables hadn't gone bad in her fridge yet. Daniel, give me a second. My voice came out rougher than I wanted it to. I turned off the burner, wiped my hands on a dish towel I didn't actually need to wipe them on, and finally looked at her. I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through it without stopping me halfway, because if you stop me, I might lose my nerve. She went quiet, sat down slowly at the kitchen table, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. At the hospital, I said, there was a form, the intake one. You'd already filled it out before they took you back, and it was still sitting on the counter when I went up to talk to the receptionist. I paused. I saw what you wrote. Under relationship. Her face changed. Not shock exactly. More like she'd been caught at something she didn't expect anyone to catch her at. I wasn't trying to read it, I said quickly. It was right there. And then a few days later I found your journal. It slipped out from under the couch cushion when I was cleaning. I only read one line, I swear, but it was enough. Which line? She said quietly. It wasn't really a question. The one about hallways. About two frightened people pretending friendship is enough. She didn't say anything for a second. Just looked down at her hands folded on the table. I need to say this now, I said, before I talk myself out of it again, because I've been talking myself out of it for 4 years and I almost didn't get the chance to say it at all. Watching you collapse in this kitchen. Sitting in that waiting room not knowing if you were okay. It knocked something loose in me. I kept thinking about every fire escape night, every dumb little thing we never talked about, and I realized I've spent 4 years being careful with you when what I actually wanted the whole time was to stop being careful. Her eyes had gone glassy, but she hadn't said anything yet, so I kept going, because stopping now felt worse than finishing. Every ordinary day got better just because you were part of it. That's not a small thing to me. And almost losing you, even for those few hours, taught me something I should have figured out a long time ago. Waiting too long to say what you feel can cost you the chance to ever say it. For a moment she just sat there, and I genuinely didn't know which way this was going to go. Then her eyes spilled over, and a smile broke through the tears, slow and a little shaky at the edges, and she reached across the table and grabbed my hand like she was afraid I might pull it back. I wrote that on the form because I was scared, she said, voice cracking a little. Not scared of you. Scared it might actually be serious, whatever was happening to me. I thought, if that ends up being the last form I ever fill out, I wanted one true sentence to exist somewhere, even if nobody ever understood what it meant. She laughed, wet and a little embarrassed. I never thought you'd be the one who found it. Well, I did. You did. She squeezed my hand. Took you 4 years. You didn't say anything either. I know. She wiped at her face with her free hand, still holding onto mine with the other. We're both idiots. We sat at that table for a long time after that, dinner mostly forgotten, going cold on the stove behind me. For years of things we hadn't said finally spilling out between us in messy, overlapping pieces. Half-finished sentences, a lot of wait, when did you? And, I thought you didn't. Until eventually we weren't really talking anymore, just sitting close, her head against my shoulder, both of us quiet in a way that finally felt honest instead of just careful. At some point she pulled back a little, just enough to look at me properly, still wiping at her face with the sleeve of her cardigan. So what happens now, she said. Like practically, we still live across a hallway from each other. I mean, that seems like a solvable problem. Daniel, I don't know, I admitted. I haven't exactly thought this far ahead. I was mostly focused on getting through the sentence without chickening out. She laughed at that, really laughed, the kind that comes out a little too loud and a little wet from crying 2 minutes earlier. You didn't chicken out. That's new for you. For years overdue. But sure. She reached over and swiped at the pasta I'd made. Now cold. Taking a bite straight from the pan like she hadn't just spent a week recovering from a hospital visit. This is terrible, by the way, she said, mouth still half full. The pasta. It's terrible. You've made it 4 times this week and it's gotten worse each time. I have a very limited skill set. I noticed. She set the fork down and reached for my hand again. Quieter now, the joke fading out of her voice. I meant what was in the journal, Daniel. I wasn't just writing something dramatic because I was scared. I felt that way about you for a long time. Longer than I think either of us wants to admit, honestly. How long? She thought about it, tilting her head. The night I fell asleep on your shoulder. After that bad shift. Second year, maybe. I remember waking up and being terrified you'd felt me do it, and then being even more terrified that I wanted to do it again. I hadn't told her I remembered that night in as much detail as I did. Hadn't mentioned the 20 minutes I'd sat frozen on my own couch, too scared to move. Hearing her bring it up herself, unprompted, matching almost exactly what I'd been turning over in the waiting room hours earlier, made something in my chest loosen that had been tight for longer than that one morning. I remember that night, I said. I've thought about it more than I probably should have. We're both ridiculous, she said again, shaking her head, but she was smiling when she said it, and she didn't let go of my hand. We ended up ordering actual food an hour later, since the pasta was a lost cause by then, and ate on the couch instead of at the table, her feet in my lap, both of us talking in a way we hadn't let ourselves talk in 4 years. Not carefully, not measured, just saying things as they came to us. She told me about being scared in the ambulance-adjacent moments right before she blacked out, about writing that line on the form almost on impulse, hand shaking, not entirely sure why those particular words came out instead of something simpler. I told her about the drive over, about running the red light, about sitting in that chair convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. It was close to midnight before either of us mentioned sleep, and even then, neither of us moved right away. It felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like there was nowhere else either of us needed to be. Nothing changed overnight, not in some big dramatic way. It changed the way most real things change. Slowly, in small moments that only added up to something once you looked back at them later. Morning coffee stopped being something we grabbed separately in our own kitchens and became something we shared, her place 1 week, mine the next, whichever apartment had cleaner dishes that day. The fire escape, the spot where we used to sit quietly avoiding hard conversations, turned into the place where we actually planned things out loud instead. Weekend trips we kept talking about and occasionally followed through on. Her cutting back her shift hours slowly over a few months once she stopped feeling guilty about it. Small, ordinary plans for an actual future, instead of the vague, unspoken almost future we'd been quietly circling for 4 years. We still burned dinner sometimes. I never did figure out garlic bread. We still argued, mostly about dumb stuff, whose turn it was to walk down and grab takeout when neither of us felt like cooking, or whether her cat was actually plotting something or just being a cat. But every one of those small, ordinary arguments carried something different now. A kind of quiet, steady gratitude neither of us had let ourselves feel out loud before that week in the hospital. Months passed. Sophia went back to her regular shifts, though I made a point of reminding her to slow down when she needed it, and she let me mostly without too much eye-rolling. I picked up steadier contract work over that stretch too, enough that I stopped feeling like I was constantly scrambling just to cover rent. Life settled into something calmer for both of us. Not perfect, not some fixed and finished thing, but calmer. Something we were actually building together now instead of just surviving next to each other. One evening in early October, almost a year to the week after that morning in her kitchen, I asked her to come sit with me out on the fire escape. Same spot, same rusted metal railing we'd worn smooth over the years just from leaning on it so often. "It's cold," she said, pulling her jacket tighter. "Why are we out here? Just sit with me a second. You're being weird again. I'm allowed to be weird sometimes." She sat, still grumbling a little about the cold, and I let a few quiet minutes pass, the city lights flickering on below us one building at a time, the same way they always had out here. Then I asked her to close her eyes. "Daniel, what are you? Just humor me. 2 seconds." She sighed, but closed them, arms crossed against the cold, clearly convinced this was some kind of joke I was building up to. When I told her to open them again, I was down on one knee on the fire escape grating, a small ring box open in my shaking hand, and her arms uncrossed so fast the motion nearly knocked her sideways. "Oh," she said quietly, just that. "Oh, I know I'm not great with words," I said. "You know that better than anyone, for years of me not saying anything at all. But I don't want to spend one more day being careful. And I don't want to keep waiting for some hospital form to tell me what I already know. I want ordinary days with you. All of them, if you'll let me have them. She didn't answer right away. For one terrible second I thought I'd somehow gotten this wrong, badly wrong. And then she was nodding, hand pressed over her mouth, saying yes somewhere underneath her own laughter and the tears that came right along with it, before I'd even technically finished the question. I don't remember standing up. I just remember her arms around my neck, both of us laughing too hard and crying a little at the same time. Right there on that same fire escape where 4 years of things we never said had finally found somewhere to go. Looking back on all of it now, I understand something I didn't understand the morning I ran that red light on Fifth. Some of the biggest regrets in life don't come from the risks people take. They come from the ones they're too scared to try. Love doesn't always show up during some perfect, cinematic moment. Sometimes it shows up in shaky handwriting on a hospital form nobody else was ever supposed to read. And if you're lucky, like I was, it gives you one more chance to finally say what you should have said all along. My sister called about 20 minutes after Sophia and I finally went back inside. Both of us still a little giddy, the ring catching the porch light every time Sophia moved her hand. I hadn't even told my sister I was planning to do it that night. I hadn't fully planned it myself until that afternoon, honestly, when I found myself standing in a jewelry store on my lunch break for the 3rd time that month and finally just bought the thing instead of walking out again. Well, my sister said the second I picked up. How did you already know? You've been weird all week. Weirder than your normal weird. So, what happened? I looked over at Sophia, who was holding her hand up to the kitchen light, turning it slightly, still smiling at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. She said yes. I told my sister. Obviously she said yes, Daniel. I could have told you that a year ago. She laughed, and I could hear something thick in her voice underneath the teasing. I'm happy for you. Both of you. You waited long enough. After I hung up, Sophia came and sat next to me on the couch, tucking her feet up under her the way she always did, leaning her head against my shoulder. You told her before you told me you were planning this, she said. Not really a complaint, more just an observation. I didn't tell her. She just knows things. Scary older sister energy. You have no idea. We sat there a while longer, not saying much, just existing in the quiet the way we used to on the fire escape years earlier, except everything about the silence felt different now. Not careful. Not two people avoiding a conversation neither of them was ready to have. Just two people who'd already had it, finally, and were allowed to just sit together without anything left unsaid hanging over the room. The wedding, when it came the following spring, was small. Neither of us wanted anything big. A backyard, some folding chairs borrowed from her hospital's break room of all places. My sister crying through the whole thing despite insisting beforehand she wouldn't. Sophia wore her hair pulled back the same messy way she always wore it, refusing to let anyone talk her into something more done up for the occasion. This is who he's marrying, she told the stylist who came to help. Might as well get used to it now. We didn't move out of the building right away. It took us almost a year to actually combine the 2 apartments into one, mostly because neither of us could agree on whose furniture to keep and whose to donate, an argument that dragged on for weeks longer than it probably needed to. Her cat adjusted faster than either of us did, honestly, immediately claiming the windowsill in what used to be my apartment as his personal property. Some nights, even now, we still end up out on that same fire escape, coffee in hand, watching the same city lights flicker on the same way they always have. It's not dramatic anymore. It's just ordinary. And I think that's the part one understand now that I didn't understand 4 years ago. Sitting in that hospital waiting room with my hands shaking, terrified I'd already lost my chance before I ever had the nerve to take it. The extraordinary thing was never going to be some big moment. It was always going to be this: coffee going cold on a fire escape railing, an argument about furniture, a cat claiming a windowsill, a life built slowly out of 1,000 ordinary days I almost let fear talk me out of ever having. Sophia still keeps that old journal, by the way. She showed it to me properly a few months after the proposal, sitting cross-legged on our bed. Flipping to the page, I'd caught a glimpse of that afternoon under the couch cushion. There were other entries in there too, ones I still haven't read and probably never will, because some things are allowed to stay hers alone. But that one page, the one about hallways and frightened people, she'd since added a line underneath it, dated the night of the proposal, just 3 words long. I read it once and didn't need to read it again. Some sentences you just carry with you after that.